Check Podcasts. Hi, I'm Bruce Williams, CEO of the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce. This is Chamber Chats, coming to you as always from the podcasting studio here at Check Television, one of our chamber champions. I would like, as always, to begin by acknowledging that I live and work in the unceded ancestral territories of the Lekwungen-speaking nations, the Songhees and the Esquimalt. Chamber Chats is made possible by the support of Island Savings, a division of First West Credit Union, and by C-SPAN Victoria Shipyards. So we had some municipal elections this fall. We had some changes. We had some unexpected outcomes, and we had some things that we kind of thought were going to happen. But we have a whole new slate of people in some municipalities, including the one that everybody talks about, which is Victoria. And the newly elected mayor of Victoria is Marianne Alto, and she joins us now. Mayor, thank you for being here.
Well, it's always my pleasure, Bruce.
So I guess the obvious question, one that you get asked all the time, is why did you want to run for and become the mayor? Why did you want the job?
That is an excellent question. I ask myself that sometimes.
I'll bet you do.
But actually, no, it's more seriously. As you know, I was a counselor for 12 years. And through that time, I worked on some pretty special topics and issues and projects. And I really felt that it was important to have someone in the chair who recognized the importance of maintaining those and working on them, but also looking ahead to some new ideas and some fresh blood as well. So for me, it was partly continuity, partly, I guess, a sense that I think I bring some different skills to the chair, which are, I hope, going to be very useful in the times that are ahead. And it seemed to me, I will say that I did encourage others to consider running for the position. But I couldn't find anyone that I thought would do perhaps a really great job. So it ended up being, okay, I guess I'll do it. If I can't encourage other people to do it if I'm not willing to do it myself.
Yeah, there you go. You and I know each other. You're a very balanced person. You're a thoughtful person. You're a very measured person. How will that define your role as mayor?
Thank you. That's very kind. I do try and be all of those things, certainly. And I do think, when I reference what I think is going to be necessary and helpful in the next few years, those are some of the qualities that I think will be really key. I've always lamented for some years now the degradation of civil discourse in public affairs. I think that whether COVID has had a significant impact, I guess, is debatable, although I do think that it did isolate us quite tremendously. And I think in that period of time, it really exacerbated the trend that was already in existence, where people seem to lose a little respect for the type of interaction that was respectful, civil, calm, rational. I mean, all of those things that certainly, when I learned about public debating and public affairs and social justice and all those things we like to work on, that was integral. It was integral for us to be all of those things. And seeing all of that wear down over the last decade or so, it seemed to me that the challenges ahead of us as our city truly becomes a city, it faces city and urban issues, that was going to be a very important mainstay in mayor's chair. I think that, you have I'm sure we'll talk about a very eclectic group of people at the table now. And I think that in order to bring out the best in them, you want someone at the chair who has some experience and who is balanced and calm and isn't going to overreact and perhaps just bring a bit of that tone back into the debate.
Yeah, so when council now gathers, when you convene, there are 9 of you at the table.
Indeed, yes.
And 2 of you have been there before, but 7 have not.
Indeed.
So Councillor Chris Coleman and you are returning to positions previously held on council. The rest of them are brand new. So what are the pros and cons of having that kind of a fresh, clean slate?
Yeah. Well, the pros are just that. It is a fresh, clean slate. And these people are all coming in with exciting ideas and hopes and dreams and a whole different range of things that they'd like to accomplish. So that's very exciting, and I'm very hopeful about that. I think the downside is that, they don't necessarily know the ways to do all of those things, to accomplish all of those things. And so there is certainly a learning time that we're in right now. And we have very deliberately constructed about a 6 to 8 week period where we're really throwing at them an enormous amount of information about existing policies and procedures, about the ways that we have done business. That isn't to say that it's the best way, but just so that they kind of know the baseline. And a lot of information about the city, about the city's evolution, about the issues that we're all facing, so that we can bring them to a point pretty fast where they have at least a solid base from which to begin to make important decisions. We were really trying to make sure that before they were confronted with some very complicated and very delicate very important decisions, particularly around land use, that they had enough information to be able to bring that to bear, along, of course, with their own perspectives and values and judgments. But we're in a period right now, actually, where we're just about finished all of that different inundation with information. And so we do take a break at the end of December for a couple of weeks. And so our goal is to get everybody up to speed before that, so that when we come back in January, we'll be able to face it head on. I did ask one of the new counselors how they were feeling about our progress, and the answer that I received was very much like I'm standing in front of a very, very heavy fire hose that's coming at me at 100 miles an hour,
Yeah.
which is good because that's exactly what we were intending to try and give them a sense of it's a big job. And so we hope you're ready. We're trying to make you as prepared as possible.
When you talk about ways of doing business, I want to just wade right into that right now. One of the things that people will very often talk about in critical terms, quite honestly, with the City of Victoria is the amount of time involved in the permitting process and approvals
Yes.
and all that sort of thing like that. How can that and will that become more efficient and
Yeah.
faster?
Yeah, you're right. It is a real struggle, and I think there's a challenge to be had between balancing what's necessary and balancing what's important for us to achieve. There are some necessary steps that we have that we're required to take because we're responsible for evaluations and determining that other requirements that are set not necessarily by ourselves are met. Having said that, there's absolutely room for improvement for all of the different processes, not just permitting, but around all of the housing approvals and the various other types of approvals that the city works with. So that is an absolute priority. There have been some improvements made over the years in certain areas, and we'll continue to do that. But it is certainly one of the things that the city has a reasonable amount of control over. And so as we begin, particularly in housing, to work more and more closely with the province and some of the announcements that they've made recently around their priorities in housing, our responsibility is to make it as easy as possible. And we're going to be required to make it easier and easier based on what I understand the province is about to demand.
Yeah, because then Minister, now Premier David Eby was the one that
Mhm.
said, you know what, we might just step in and override some decisions made by municipalities. I want to talk about that next. Our guest on Chamber Chats today is Victoria Mayor Marianne Alto. Still relatively new in the job, but Mayor, we just had made mention of the fact that David Eby, when he was the Minister of Housing and now as the Premier, has said that they may step in and, for lack of a better term, override a decision made by a municipal council, especially around housing.
Mhm.
Um, what's that going to look like? How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm actually pretty hopeful, to be honest. I did have a chance to see the legislation just the day it was released. I think that was Monday. And as you remember, I was actually at the announcement on behalf of the city. And that's because I think my understanding of what the premier is trying to accomplish is to create expectations around what housing needs to be built and how quickly and what they look like and the different types and where they are across all the municipalities in the province. And there's certainly a hugely eclectic response to building housing, as you well know, and certainly the challenges we've had in Victoria. Change is hard. We need to try and build as much housing as we possibly can in the right ways for the right types of demographics across the whole city. And my understanding of Premier Eby's approach is that he wants to do that for the whole province in every municipality. So from what I've read and what I understand of the legislation, if you're a community or a municipality that is building and is building to your own targets, because we do all have a hand in setting those targets, everything's great. And in fact, there are some rewards that are there to be had if we do meet those targets. And if you're not, then they're going to have a conversation. And personally, I think I'm okay with that. And as Premier Eby said on Monday, this is a crisis unlike any we've seen, I think, in decades, if ever. The number of people who are unhoused or who are underhoused or who are simply being moved out of their home municipalities because they can't afford to stay there, it's staggering. And I think if ever there was a topic or an issue or a responsibility that a municipality should have, it should be in trying to create and provide homes for its own residents, whether they're current residents or future residents. And so for me, I think that the legislation, as I understand it, is pretty balanced, and that if you're in the business of creating homes for people, you're going to do fine. If you're not so excited about that, you might need to have help.
So I want to unpack a little bit of that, if we may. Let's talk about
Sure.
the role of a municipality versus the CRD versus the province, even the feds, when it comes to either collaboration or working separately in creating housing. What's the role of each of those levels of government?
Well, that's a great question. If I can answer that in 30 seconds, I might be famous. I think that the feds primarily are a funder. And, when we look back years ago when they had really significant federal funding housing programs, there was a lot of what we used to call social housing built. Affordable housing is what we would call it now, and sometimes subsidized housing or supportive housing as well. But those programs stopped decades ago. And in the intervening times is when you saw, I think, the beginning, if you look at it statistically, the beginning of the slide in the development of certainly affordable housing, but of housing in general. And so I think for me, I would hope that the federal government would return to being a significant funder across the country in providing supportive financial programs for housing. For the province has a much more direct role in perhaps steering where that goes, what it looks like. And I think in addition to the feds, the province and the federal government together are also a funder primarily. But I think the province probably sees itself as having a bit more decision making, a bit more influence perhaps than just providing a check. And they have their own BC Housing. I think Premier Eby on Monday mentioned that it was one of the largest not-for-profit housing corporations in the continent, and certainly in Canada, but I think in the continent he was referencing. And in that context, it means that the government has moved into this area of not just saying, here's money, but is providing direction and support and actually building some very specific housing programs. So they're kind of in that interesting in between where they actually build housing and then they actually pay for housing. The region has an interesting role because it doesn't so much build housing as it's a bit of almost like an advocate facilitator. So it's in the business of being partners with various other levels to manage the funding, to provide advice and direction on where it can be used, how it can be used. And then when it comes to the city, to the municipality, it's our job to make sure that what's built fits. And to a certain extent, we do have some funding that we, as you well know, is that we provide for not-for-profit housing, and it's currently the policy is $10,000 per bedroom for a not-for-profit society that's building here in the city. But that's pretty nominal when you think of the costs of building any type of a large complex or any complex really. So our job is more about enabling and refining the projects to ensure that whatever they are, however they look, that they fit in with the neighborhood to a certain extent, that they meet some of the local housing goals around quantity and quality and around the continuum of affordability. And we're kind of the last piece that gives direction to what actually is going to get built on a particular piece of land.
And it's transformative in the creation of what a community and a city is going to look like, right? So another piece
it
of
is,
that.
and actually, just before you move on, I mean, I think that's a really important word, and it's one of the phrases actually that I've been trying to get people to wrap their heads around, and I mentioned it in my remarks on the first day when we were sworn in, and that is that what I'm looking for in the next few years is sort of plans and actions that will create an intentional transformation. And I speak of very much about their change is coming, like it or not. And for me, the real bottom line here is I don't want it to be random. If there is going to be change, if there is going to be transformation, I want it to be intentional and planned because that's the best way for us to get the best possible outcome for the most people. If we just sit back and put our hands up, it's going to happen anyway, but it's going to happen randomly and I believe without the best possible outcomes.
And when these housing units are created and when housing develops all across the region, getting people from point A to point B is a big deal. At the Chamber, we always talk about workplace housing that's adjacent to where people actually work. And a piece of that is also making transit a bit more accessible for people too. So kind of a regional transit plan has been in the conversation for quite some time. What are your thoughts on that? What can be done to move that forward?
I absolutely think that's essential. And I'm really pleased to be going back to the CRD table this term. I think the CRD has a significant role to play in creating that type of a regional plan for transportation. I mean, transit obviously is a key role, a key piece of that, but there's also corollary conversations that can be happening around alternative ways to deal with, bikes, buses, trains. I think that's still something that could be on the table. Any type of the ways that we can actually encourage people to move more efficiently. The most compelling scenes that you can see are those great presentations that transit does where they show a roadway where on the one side, there's 4 lanes of traffic with 60 cars, and on the other side, there's 4 lanes of traffic with 1 bus. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing more compelling than that simple view that says, "Isn't this better?" And of course, the downside is that buses traditionally tend to be infrequent and unreliable from the perspective of getting thousands and thousands of people where they need to go efficiently. So yes, the regional transportation plan, key transit is absolutely essential with that. I will be going to the Regional Transit Commission with one of my colleagues, and I know that is going to be a continuing conversation. And I really hope actually that the CRD jumps into this. There have been years of talk, as you mentioned, about a transportation plan for the region. I don't think it can be anything other than regional. It's just foolhardy to think any one or two municipalities can do it alone. We have to look at the region around transportation in particular if we're going to serve the needs of the residents broadly.
And just for the record, my own personal opinion, I happen to be a fan of bike lanes because Amanda and I are cyclists and we use them. And we could talk about rail, but we don't have that kind of time today.
Yeah.
What I do want to talk, though, on the state of housing is that there are still people camping in parks, and I want to talk about that next. Our guest today on Chamber Chats is Marianne Alto, the mayor of the city of Victoria. Mayor, we are still seeing some people camping in parks. Stadacona Park comes to mind. There's still some people elsewhere doing that as well. We're getting into the cold season, all the issues around that. What's going on with people camping in parks?
Yeah. Well, as you know, Bruce, after we moved our way through the worst of COVID, we went back to our original restrictions around when people can overnight in parks, when they can shelter. And so that is still prevalent. And as you may know, that's a 7-to-7 bylaw. But even in the face of that, I think we have a much larger issue to address. And that's the issue of what we do with folks who don't have any other options. And I mean, obviously, the long-term answer to that is housing, but not just a room, but it's housing that has the appropriate mental and physical health supporters that needs to be part of that. And I'm hoping that's coming with some of the complex care ideas that are coming out of the provincial government. But again, that's a long term, I think, or maybe a medium term if we're really hopeful. But the short term has to be something that we address much more quickly. And along with some of the unhoused folks come also complex health issues. So this is not just a matter of moving people off of or out of the park or off of the boulevard. It's about figuring out the best place for them to go. I'm encouraged, I have to say, by what has been implied by the provincial government about their forays into dealing with the downtown east side. I don't think Victoria has the same degree of issues, but our issues are similar and perhaps smaller numbers. And I'm really interested to see how that works for the downtown east side, because it would be my preference for us to do a version of that, a locally appropriate version of that for the city of Victoria. So there's much to be done with the province collaboratively, because we can't just pick people up and move them. There's no place for them to go. And ultimately it becomes that conundrum. It's impossible for anyone, I think, to believe that living on the roadway or in a park is something anyone would choose. The question becomes, what is the better option and how do we get them there? I'm not prepared for the city of Victoria to answer that question on its own. It's not fair. This is not just a city of Victoria issue. It's a regional issue. It's a provincial issue. And I'm encouraged by the moves that the province seem to be taking. I'm looking forward to seeing how they work in some of the larger municipalities. And I will say that I will be having conversations with the province very soon about what that looks like in Victoria. We must do something. We must. These people are our residents too. It may be that they're unhoused, but they're still Victorians. And we have to find a way forward. And I believe we will, but we can't do it alone.
And for those who don't have the background on complex care, the simple explanation of that is that you treat each person as an individual, not sort of as a herd of people that you put in a facility or something. So right. Each of them getting the independent care and support that they need. So when we talk about that, Mayor, that then brings the role of the police into it, which got really complicated through the pandemic when police are called in because people feel that the criminal activity associated with those that are not being housed right now and those spending a lot of time on the streets. At the root of all that is a housing and mental health crisis. Yet much of the attention goes to the crime and violence that's associated with it. So can you talk a little bit about the role of police in all of this and the supports that they need to help people manage mental health?
Yeah, and those are two very important questions that you asked. So the first part, when a role of the police, I believe very fundamentally that the police have a role in our communities, and their role is what they do best, and that's preventing and responding to crime. The trouble, the challenge, the really difficult conundrum for someone in my position is to say, how do we take away the enormous amount of time police spend, and they tell us each year that it's between 50 and 80% of their time are dealing with non-criminal matters. And so how do we deal with those matters in a way which allow the police to do their really excellent work around crime prevention and crime response? And one of those answers is, of course, to create programs that are civilian-based, but provide the types of support and care that you've been describing under complex care. And as you may know, we do have a pilot project right here in Victoria, one of the peer-assisted care teams, the PAC teams, that I understand has been operating, I think, since about August, and it has another 8 to 10 months to go, which essentially is a collection of civilian experts, healthcare experts, some security experts, some psychological and therapeutic experts, that sort of thing. Non-police, but they're there in a crisis response type of methodology to try and deal with some of the issues that naturally follow to police. Because when you see someone in crisis, what do? You call 911. And so this is ideally set up to be part of that 911 system at some point, where you would eventually be able to say, look, there's no crime being undertaken here, but there is a person in crisis and they need help. So that essentially is the goal for that type of a program. And I think, if I recall correctly, that when Premier Eby was announcing his crime and security programs on Sunday, he actually referenced that there was a dozen more of those teams that were about to be deployed throughout the province. So I think there's a growing appetite for that type of a crisis response, but in a civilian model, which will then, I think, free up the police to do the crime-related work that they do well. The second part of your question is the support for police, and that's hugely important. We hear all the time that because of the overwhelming demands on policing, on police officers, they often have a significant number of officers who are off on various leaves, whether it's psychological leave or physical leave. And that puts a huge burden on the rest of the force, and obviously changes dramatically what their capacity is. So I think we need to pay more attention to creating some of the support systems we think of for non-police people. You talk about community supports, and you think about psychological care, physical care, mental health care, all those things. We don't often associate those as being useful or needs of police officers. And I think we need to get away from this old school sense of, you're a strong, resilient guy as a police officer and you don't need any help. They're people. And the best police officers remember that they're human too, and that's how they present. And there's some incredibly talented people in our police service here in Victoria. And they have to be seen to be not just policing, but to be part of the community. And I'm a huge fan of community policing. I think that as the police service evolves, and it is, and it must, that there will be a much greater appetite and willingness to move into what we used to call community policing, that person who creates relationships with neighborhoods, who creates relationships with people, and is part of the community. Those are, in my experience, those are the most productive, the best police officers, in the sense that they know when something's happening, and they often know why. And they have the relationships to be able to deal with that before it becomes out of control.
Yeah. We have so much more to talk about, but we're out of time.
Yeah.
So
we're
going to have to do this again.
I'd love to.
Which we will very shortly. Very much appreciate your time, Mayor. I know how busy you are, but we'll catch up with you soon on another Chamber Chat. Our guest today has been Marianne Alto, the Mayor of the City of Victoria. And I'm Bruce Williams. We'll see you again soon for another Chamber Chat.